Recording?
Yeah, we're
Yeah.
recording.
Okay. Okay. So, Huda, you can
Okay.
mute everyone except for Rityusha.
So just
Or
one sec.
and is everyone here?
Sorry if I cut you off there, Rija. Like I was just muting everyone.
Yeah, so in continuation with yesterday's lecture, today the first part of the lecture, I would like to focus upon the impact of paradigms on research methodologies within international relations and specifically also on area studies, quantitative research and policy research. So one of the articles that I had actually shared with you all guys uh, talked about integrating the social sciences, area studies, quantitative methods, and problem-oriented research. And this was by Craig Calhoun. So I will actually not really talk too much about the first initial part of the article. I would rather focus on the latter half. And this is where Calhoun actually brings out the kind of paradigms that were dominant throughout the last 70 years and how they sort of impacted research on in international relations, and also how the methodologies then came to be shaped about in IR in terms of the focus of IR. So yesterday we talked about that how the dominant paradigm in the post World War period was actually American, which was then basically giving rise to the discussions regarding Cold War and nuclear arms race, and also the major funding in IR that was actually done by Ford Foundation and other such organizations from coming from the United States. And the focus of all of this research in international relations was actually world leadership of the United States. And that continued for at least good 3 decades. In the meanwhile, the kind of research that was happening in other parts of the Western world, like Germany or England, actually focused on area studies and the regions and other parts of the world outside the Western academia as Islamic or Indic or Chinese civilization, and this kind of a research actually had a kind of objectivity which was very oriental in nature. So that entire debate about orientalism versus occidentalism and so on and so forth emerges during this time period. Now coming to what was happening in terms of South Asian studies, for instance, or Russian or Eurasian studies or East European studies, one could see that the focus of Russian and East European studies was primarily politics during the Cold War and post-Cold War years. And whereas in South Asian studies, the focus became certain political issues, but largely it was about civilization and culture. So a lot of studies from South Asia emanated, which focused on civilizational and cultural development of the region. Now, economic development, on the other hand, was something that was focused upon in terms of methodologies for Latin American studies, whereas formation of new nations was something which was a key theme for the African studies. So the way regions had been divided, paradigms had also been divided therein. So if you came across something regarding India, it was mostly in the context of civilization and culture, and very little was devoted to aspects of politics or aspects of security and strategy. And this was all during the Cold War and continues well beyond Cold War. However, post Cold War, we can also see an emergence of thematics around modernization, economic development, and political reforms as and when international relations started expanding in terms of the methodologies that were being employed. And now the centers of research were actually expanding in terms of where one was looking at and where one wanted to look at and coming from where. It became quite obvious that debates around modernization, economic development, and political reform, creation of new national institutions, social transformation, expansion of literacy and consequent cultural production, and even changes in psychological attitudes regarding regions came about. And therefore, we see a major shift in the kind of methodologies that is there. So the impact of paradigms is actually very interesting. It gives us an insight into even current existing methodologies as to what is their origin and now how they are being employed. Many times we tend to follow, if we are new to the field, we tend to follow certain methodologies as given, and we feel that this is an acceptable paradigm, this is an acceptable methodology, because a lot of literature already exists around this in international relations, so it must be the way to go. And this is the kind of attitude that sort of was negated with the expansion of paradigmatic discourse within international relations. And as I just outlined, if you get back to that particular reading, you will have a lot of insight in that. This also encouraged two-way trade in which area knowledge was fitted and completed the disciplinary analytical framework, which also gave a generalization to entire disciplinary framework of international relations, giving structure to area knowledge and area becoming a conceptual rather than just analytical category, as we have discussed yesterday. Now, I'll just skip the rest of the article in that sense, and I'm sure you'll get back to it and read some more, and then we can sort of have a discussion around that. My focus is going to be now primarily in terms of how quantitative studies basically came about. And in the similar manner as area studies, quantitative studies also had to face a lot of paradigmatic shifts and saw different paradigms ruling at different points in time. Now, like area studies, quantification and mathematical formalization also had a long history in social sciences, but it received a new emphasis from wartime engagements. The war shaped rise of modern nation states, and also came along with it came the rise of modern computing, the development of large data sets, and strategic thinking that contributed to the probability of conflict or peace, as it were. And a lot of usage of game theory was something that we saw around these times. Now, the rise of testing in terms of psychology of major actors involved in the area disciplines was also very prominent, and it was also given a lot of impetus by its use in military efforts to classify recruits, as well as by the expansion of public schooling. So both in terms of military training and general education, the use of psychology also emerged, and this also had a lot of impact on the kind of quantitative research that was happening in within international relations, within area studies, and within comparative area studies. Now, if one were to just very briefly trace the kind of methods within quantitative methodology, one could see that descriptive statistics, and then on the basis of descriptive statistics, an idea about probability of war was one of the things that sort of started this expansion of quantification within IR. Moving on from there, one could get into survey research, where initially the surveys were carried out by researchers themselves, but then survey data was later on transformed and informed by certain organizations. So in that sense, the collection of survey became secondary. Specialized organizations started collecting survey data, big data, and that was subsequently used by researchers to sort of corroborate their finding, and so on and so forth. This also gave a lot of impetus to studies around elections, inequality, race, education, and other topical themes as they emerged out of the discussions within the area studies, as we just saw in the previous section. So if the theme, the paradigmatic theme within area studies was, say, development, and one was looking at the impact of development vis-a-vis certain kind of political systems, then correspondingly within quantitative methodologies, we would see a lot of data being collected regarding, say, inequalities, regarding the proliferation of income, and other such topics, which are related to the paradigmatic shift in area studies. Survey data collection now is also, today also is one of the technical skills primarily required to organize non-academic basics, which are supposed to be present once one starts looking at, the research problematic at hand. So none of these quantitative methods, for instance, are out of fashion per se, but we can always see that some of them would be hierarchically better placed than the other during a particular decade or during a particular time period in history. Now, data analytics, for instance, or big data is the ruling method right now within quantitative methodology, and it is being deployed on a variety of pre-existing data sources through computerization, through creation of large data sets, and so on and so forth. And these are being used to sort of predict certain kind of outcomes. Now, this kind of a existence of multiple methods within certain methodologies also gave rise to the practice of mixing methods, the idea of bringing qualitative and quantitative approaches in one's research design together. So the second article that I had shared with you was basically by Julia Brannon, and she also talks about how methods had been mixed by bringing in qualitative and quantitative together. And the case for separate paradigms in that sense for both quantitative and qualitative, despite having different epistemological assumptions and despite belonging to different kind of research cultures, sort of came together. In fact, there was greater reflexivity that sort of was brought forth through this mixing together of quantitative and qualitative. And one can take an example here. For instance, if you were encouraged to encounter a particular finding through new ways of relating the voices of marginalized groups, and bring those voices to academic knowledge, and also as by way of an expression of a researcher's interpretation, the mixing of quantitative and qualitative helped in that sense. So one could still have the agenda that one began with in qualitative research, but employing the quantitative became eased that kind of agenda, and it became easier to have a greater reflexivity, a greater capacity to get back to the kind of results that one was expecting, one was trying to elucidate, and elucidate it with a lot of greater data and greater empirics, and get back to the field again and again in that sense. Now, on the quantitative front, researchers have been constantly looking at development of certain skills in the sense of doing away with the barricades of not just quantitative qualitative, but also doing away with the barricades of disciplinary boundaries within qualitative. So once you mix qualitative with quantitative, one tries to move beyond this kind of disciplinary boundary, this kind of disciplinary isolationism, and bring in the techniques, bring in the perspectives, bring in the paradigms from different disciplines as they exist, and sort of make a good fusion of the complex statistical techniques that one might be employing within quantitative. Now, there's a lot of overlap, even though there is a big case regarding distinction between quantitative and qualitative. Today, what we accept as one of the interesting methods is actually an overlap or a mixing method of both quantitative and qualitative. And this overlap occurs in various fields. So this overlap is actually there from point A of the research design to point Z, if that is the culmination point of one's research design. And it's actually there along all the steps. So the first step is perhaps where you see this overlap very clearly is the context of inquiry. So whatever is the contextual inquiry that the researcher is trying to look at in their research design, one can always bring in an overlap of the quantitative and qualitative. The second is the context of justification. How do you justify your inquiry? What is the premise through which you've begun your inquiry? And the third stage is corroboration. So where you start having certain idea from the field, which is basically a corroboration of your thesis, your hypothesis, or it's a corroboration of your research question, that this is a valid question and it demands an inquiry. Now, for that, the quantitative helps in getting the same kind of result time and again, which can be derived basically from quantitative, but even qualitative techniques are used to sort of get the same result again and again. And this is also called the N loop, where N is the variable, and that doesn't change every time you go and do your experiment on the field. You conduct the same kind of exercise, you get the same result, which is N. So you get an end loop, which is also known as same result within quotes. Yeah. So within corroboration, you also have elaboration, where qualitative data analysis helps the quantitative findings in various cases by being able to elaborate upon them. So you have a statistical data, but you also have the explanation of that statistical data by employing certain qualitative methods. Then you have complementarity. So from corroboration to elaboration to complementarity, we can see that there is a huge overlap between qualitative and quantitative. And sometimes this also might lead to certain contradictions, where qualitative data and quantitative data might not sit very well together and may get into a conflict, which also gives an interesting insight into the real sense of field, as it were. And it can also lead us to some kind of falsification of the hypothesis that we might have begun with. So research design, fieldwork, interpretation, contextualization of the research, through all of these phases, one can see a lot of overlapping of both methods, basically quantitative and qualitative. Now, I would like to, in this next 5 to 10 minutes, I would like to focus upon how to collect data in social sciences. So if one is to start mixing qualitative and quantitative most of the times for better corroboration, for better sort of contextualization and better result, and sometimes also to bring out the contradictions, then how does one go about collecting data in social sciences? Now, this is an interesting sort of trajectory that has been there for this whole idea of bringing qualitative and quantitative together. Basically, if one, I mean, what I'm going to start elaborating as some of the steps in collection of data is one way of going about it. It's not necessarily the only way, but just one of the ways. So in this particular thematic, which I'm going to explain, one goes about systematically conducting surveys and interviews, public opinion pollings or questionnaires. And all this time we see a mix of both qualitative and quantitative here. The second step could be that scientific observation as systematic consideration and interpretation of human behavior. So here as well, you can bring in various methods of both quantitative and qualitative. The third step is experimentation, which is in social sciences, the investigation of the arrangement of various variables that we have at our disposal. And finally, we can also do content analysis, which is basically analysis and coding of textual materials. Now, when you do content analysis, again, as I said, through all of these 4 steps, systematic conduction of survey and interview, scientific observation, experiment, and content analysis, all throughout, one can always employ different methods from both quantitative and qualitative. So within quantitative, we can have a testing of theory-driven hypothesis. How frequent is that hypothesis? That means testing the frequency of the hypothesis, amount and positive, negative valency of textual components, which means that whether a certain phenomena is increasing or decreasing, depending on the kind of main variable that we have chosen. So whether it's a downward curve, whether this is an upward curve, and so on and so forth, which is positive, negative valency of textual components, and certain numerical interlinkages, right? Within qualitative, on the other hand, we can have intersubjectively renewable interpretation of any phenomena that we've chosen to sort of understand. Now, very briefly, within quantitative methods, the description of social phenomena or testing of hypothesis is possible through empirical data sets. And basically, it is usually employing larger data sets and social statistical analysis, as well as standardized data, and it is independent of observers' own subjectivity. Now, when one says that it is independent of observers' own subjectivity, one has to keep in mind that the variables that one might have actually chosen as variables of collecting data might have a certain subjectivity to themselves. So, for instance, if you want to look at poverty, you want to diagnose poverty and you want to deconstruct poverty, you might have very subjective understanding of poverty. And the variables through which you choose to elaborate upon poverty actually has your subjective reference point to it. So to say that quantitative method is actually devoid of or independent of observers' subjectivity is not correct in totality. There is always an element of subjectivity even within quantitative method, even though to a large extent it can be done away with. Now, since we've been using these words quite frequently, what is a variable? Variable is basically a characteristic or an attribute of a particular phenomena that we are trying to measure in quantitative terms, or we're trying to understand in qualitative terms. And what is correlation? Basically, it's statistical, but not necessarily. A correlation is statistical relationship between two or more variables. Why would I say statistical? Because it is right now in the context of quantitative method. Had it been qualitative, then correlation is about how the causality is situated between these two variables or more variables, between more than two variables. What is a sample? Sample is basically the pool of cases that we are actually trying to analyze. It can be random, it can be non-random. And what is a data set? Basically, a data set contains the variables that we have chosen for the research for a specific sample. Now, in terms of how to investigate correlation and causation. So this is where actually the role of research design comes. So when you're trying to write a particular, say, an article, or you're trying to look at a particular problem, every piece of writing would have a certain research design in that sense, where first and foremost, I think it's most important to formulate the research question itself. And within that research question, the placement of independent and dependent variable is quite important, which can describe the phenomena that you're trying to investigate. So you need to identify the two variables, minimum two variables, between which you're trying to establish a correlation or establish a causality. You're trying to find out what causes what and then how, right? So the third thing that is very important in research design is basically finding out suitable data set, which provides the variables that you just now posited as your dependent and independent variable. After the suitable data set, it's the job of the researcher to basically find out the sample of the data set. So you go on collecting a big sample or a small sample, as it depends on the scope of your research actually, and also choose a suitable time frame. So that also helps delineate the scope of research in that sense. Now, after all of this, one has to actually get down to the actual business of calculating the degree of correlation, which is in statistical terms. But if it is qualitative analysis that one is trying to employ here, it would be the degree of correlation by way of causality. And this causality is also not entirely subjective. It has a lot of objective aspect to it. Finally, what we are left with is the interpretation of the result. So does the correlation indicate any kind of causation? So in this step, we actually differentiate what is correlation and what is causation. Once you found out certain correlation, that because of A, B declines, or because of B, C increases, this is the correlation. And therefore, now you can finally establish a particular kind of causation. Now, coming to qualitative method in the same manner, within qualitative method, the first and foremost task is investigation of social meanings of structures that you've chosen to investigate. So you every time you posit your research puzzle, in that research puzzle, as we said, that there's going to be an independent and a dependent variable. The qualitative method would help us to assign the social meaning to that independent and dependent variable. The next step within qualitative method is interview, discourse analysis, content analysis. This is concomitant with data set, finding suitable data set. And then actually not just finding the suitable data set, but also interpreting it. So you do interviews, discourse analysis, content analysis, and then you interpret and also do certain case studies. So you quantify this particular method by putting it into different kind of case studies. This can bring in over and above quantitative, it can bring in non-standardized data. So qualitative has the ability to accommodate non-standardized data. Sometimes very random data can be actually accommodated here. And one can actually attach or find or interpret intersubjective understanding to that non-standardized data. So this becomes very interesting because it also throws us deep into the array of finding out social meanings of structures and concepts and phenomena, and building upon a more nuanced version of social reality, as it were. Now, certain key concepts that keep on recurring in qualitative methods are actually material. So material for qualitative method is actually textual, visual, or any other empirical data, which is through interviews, documents, newspapers, articles, films, and so on and so forth. The term category would be employed as a formal or content related frame that basically lends theoretical attributes to the phenomena at hand. And finally, coding would be basically identifying and assigning of categories within empirical data. So every time you have a variable for which you've gone and found out certain sample in the field, now you can give a certain coding to it through qualitative method by assigning values, by assigning social, political, economic values. Now, if one had to ask the question, how to investigate data qualitatively. So you have a data set in hand, and you want to now investigate it qualitatively. That means you want to actually employ mixed method. How do you go about that? So you, again, we'll get back to that entire thing of getting back to our research design, get back to first thing, which is research question, find out suitable empirical material, which is what gave us this sample set. Then describe the context of your material, which is where you bring in the qualitative by putting in historical, sociological, political backgrounds to it, derive certain categories and which are formal, content related, which fit into the research question and the theoretical framework, and finally code the material, then edit the coding or edit the frequency analysis or intensity analysis or contingent analysis of this particular coded material. So how frequently does the phenomena occur? What is the intensity of the phenomena? What is the contingency, or what are the unintended or intended consequences of this kind of frequency or intensity? Now you finally put it all together and code the material gain by comparing it with your previous finding, the previous thing that you had through just quantitative method. So you can see that how much improvement has been there in the quantitative by adding on this qualitative analysis. And then you do the final interpretation by putting both of them together. So I think it's also important to elaborate a bit through examples, for instance. And yesterday I'd mentioned that I've written down certain probable sets of hypotheses that can actually be used as test cases to find out variables, and then get into this whole business of correlation and causation and so on and so forth. So the first one, for instance, and you might want to remember it for later discussion. The first one is the richer a country is, the more likely will it raise its proportional military expenditure. So in IR, we come across this oft repeated thing that how much should be the defense expenditure of a particular country, and does it have any kind of causality behind it? What gives rise to a higher or a lower military expenditure? So here is one hypothesis which could be tested in that sense, that the richer a country is, the more likely will it raise its proportional military expenditure. Now, if this is the hypothesis that I'm supposed to be proving, then perhaps regions become important category to analyze this. Am I going to look at the richness of a country by way of where it's located in a particular region, or I'm going to look at it in terms of its historical context, whether it's been an industrialized nation, it's been a part of the industrialized world, or whether I'm going to put in certain other categories like political or sociological or economic in that sense. How am I going to define the idea of rich country? So that's one thing. And the second thing is military expenditure. So it's easier to sort of define military expenditure because the term military expenditure is very much located in the economic of the entire military setup in that sense. So it's easier to define one variable and it's more difficult to define another variable. And now I'm supposed to posit a sort of correlation and then find out the causality here. It's easy to do this kind of exercise once one has decided what kind of perspective one wants to look at. in that sense. And I'll leave this entire thing with one more example, which is if countries are big, they are harder to govern than the smaller ones. So if you have this thing, big country and harder to govern. Now this is also a very generic, and I've chosen these two as a very generic hypothesis, and I'm just trying to elaborate how do you exactly pinpoint your variable, how do you exactly situate a causality between the variables that you've pinpointed, and then how do you go about doing the research. This is not the best example. I mean, I would not say that do research on this, but this is just an example of how you convert a situation into a research puzzle. So when one is saying that country is big, they are harder to govern than the smaller ones, then perhaps now you have to define, you have to attach a social meaning, a political meaning to the term big country. So do you mean big country in terms of power? What is power? Is it comprehensive national power kind of a discourse? Are you trying to say a big country in terms of geographical expanse? Yesterday we'd seen one of the readings regarding China, talking about some certain basic core component structures of every country, and in that she also had massive territory as one of the considerations. So is it territorial in its definitional orientation? Is it about economy? Is it about how big a country is in terms of its economy? So how are we going to sort of posit definition or meaning to this idea of a big country? And then second one then goes on to be the idea of being able to govern. So governability in that sense. So you do this kind of attachment of social meaning to both the variables, and then you go about the business of correlation and causation and so on and so forth. There are many other examples, and we can sort of look at them when we have a discussion on this. Another thing that I had actually touched upon was trying to find out the frequency, intensity, and contingent analysis of a particular set of variables and how they are related to each other, what is causing what, and how is it causing. And yesterday I had said that more than answering the question why, perhaps it's more important to answer the question how. So once we get into the business of how, why actually follows in that sense. And so how do you interpret a certain qualitative analysis? That would give us an idea into the frequency, intensity, and contingent analysis. And it's interesting to then sort of bring in the statistical methods of quantitative methodologies and make use of them through either regression analysis or statistics or some other sort of data interpretation skills. Now, another example that I would want to, and yesterday also I had given certain examples. I think the one that I had given was about European Union finding new security identity in 21st century. So today, and also Cold War about being an ideological war and so on. So today I'll try to sort of bring one more example here. And this is both, again, this requires, I mean, a good research design would actually integrate both qualitative and quantitative here, and would bring in the quantity and then try to make sense of that quantity through certain qualitative analysis. So one of the examples that I would like to bring here is now this particular hypothesis, and you can bring it up during the course of discussion. This one is international terrorism is increasingly linked to a religious dimension. Now, there's a lot of talk about terrorism, international terrorism at that, and the fact that it has a certain religious dimension. It could be across civilizations, to bring in the kind of argument that Samuel Huntington has, or it could be a particular religion. So the kind of analysis that a lot of Western academia has been doing in that sense post 9/11. So international terrorism becomes one variable, and religious dimension or religiosity or religious groups or religion becomes the second sort of component here, in which we have to try and establish a correlation and causality. Now I'll try to bring one from the field, which is China. China, I mean, if you want to throw a very generic statement in the air and then try to classify it as one of the probable research puzzles, the generic statement could be something like China is actually the big unknown, within quotes, big unknown in Western debates. So one doesn't know anything about China, so you can easily brush it under the carpet and say that it's the big unknown in Western debates. It also has a lot of ramifications. Sounds like a very generic question, a generic statement, but has a lot of ramifications. Because now categorize China, one of the core characteristics of China has been described as the big unknown. So one doesn't know China. So it's not easy to interpret. It's also not easy to accommodate Chinese discourse. It's also not easy to then practice democratization of international norms, then practice democratization of international negotiations, because it's an unknown quantity. So the very generic statement has very large ramifications in that sense. And I think a good research design, a good research puzzle would want to shy away from such grand statements, which also are very much detrimental to bringing out more nuanced version of reality and more democratic version of reality, if democracy is one of the virtues that you want to define your perspective from. It, as we said yesterday, it's important to know where you're coming from. So where you're coming from decides whether you bring in certain core sets of values as your values through which you will begin your research. I'll leave examples here. I'll try to touch upon very briefly upon content analysis as well. What is content analysis and how do you do it? I mean, I think by now at this stage, almost everybody is quite familiar with content analysis. So I'll leave it up to you to sort of ask me more questions, but I'll give you a certain example. So if I want to do a content analysis of a particular, say, set of newspapers, and my time frame is actually 9/11. So I look at the newspapers across the world on this particular date, 9/11. And for instance, I've chosen 4 newspapers and their headlines. So the first one is actually, I'm not going to name the newspapers, I'm just going to read the headlines. So first page, big news is US attacked. That's it, US attacked. The second very big newspaper, the headline is War on America. Third one is War at Home. And fourth one is Day of Terror. Now, it's not very difficult to guess where these newspapers are actually located. Where are these? I mean, War at Home would mean that this is a newspaper coming from the United States. Day of Terror, it's not that decisive. It's not very, very obvious whether this is an American newspaper, it's an American daily, or is it from some other part of the world. US attacked. This is a very interesting headline because it's telling me that US has US attacked. It could be a newspaper from the US, but it's more likely that it's not a newspaper from the US. So content analysis would take note of almost all of these aspects of the content at hand, of the text at hand. This content could be in the form of a text, it could be in the form of newspapers, it could be in the form of movies, it could be any random sample of data that one has chosen to pick and then try to corroborate the hypothesis against. So it's interesting to see the 4 headlines and then try to make sense of where they're coming from, and then actually seeing where they're coming from and see if one has been able to correlate the meaning behind the content correctly. And therefore, it becomes a very interesting exercise in that sense. Now, I'll leave all of this here, and then during the course of discussion, we can get back to it. My next phase of the research, I mean, my next part of this discussion is actually going to focus on policy research and the relationship between theory and policy. And I've given you a particular article regarding this, Stephen Walt's article regarding theory and policy in international relations. So very briefly, what is policy research? And coming from this entire discussion about area studies and quantitative methods, what is the third thing, the policy research? So policy research is basically influenced by several types of knowledge. And if one has to look at the context specific creation of knowledge in international relations, primarily the areas of diplomacy, foreign policy, development work, and so on and so forth, actually gave the idea of this kind of policy research within IR. And this was also distinct from very applied research in that sense, because it was, as I said, influenced by several types of knowledges and invariably relied upon factual knowledge that in terms of defining the variables, but also looking at current state of things in terms of having certain principles at hand. So if there was a policy that had to be derived out of a particular policy research, a policy recommendation that had to come out of policy research, there were certain theoretical and principle based premises to that policy research. So you always had what Mearsheimer, one of the IR theorists, says rule of thumbs in terms of policy research. And these rule of thumbs were basically simple decisions that were taken as prerequisites to any kind of policy recommendations. So these rule of thumbs actually were the theories behind that kind of policy research. So why would you want to know about the military expenditure? The idea is whether to increase the military expenditure, bring about a balance in military expenditure vis-a-vis some other component within the economy, or would you want to decrease the military expenditure? So there would be a simple rule of thumbs because of which you would do this kind of a research. And this rule of thumb would serve as one of the principled facets of conducting this kind of policy research. Now, policy research in that sense is not actually devoid of theory. It actually uses theories to premise its research puzzle in international relations. And there are policy debates in both domestic and foreign affairs, and which basically are often representatives of competing theoretical claims. Now, when it comes to looking at what Stephen Walt has to say, policy debate actually rests upon competing theoretical visions. That's the point that he agrees with. At the same time, he says that the gap between theory and policy sometimes widens a lot because of the norms and incentives that are dominating the academic discourse in a particular time and space, and sometimes can serve as discouragement for scholars to either do theory or do policy research. And this gap has to be normatively narrowed. It can only be done so by putting greater value on both policy as well as theory relevant works. So you could, what he terms it as policy relevant theoretical work. And this is interesting because he's trying to bridge the gap and trying to do away with the kind of prestige hierarchy that exists in doing either policy research or theoretical research. And one of the problems that he points out in that sense is that between short-term and long-term research, and there was a question yesterday that if you're not really going to the field and if you're trying to bring out certain piece of writing, how do you exactly manage this whole idea of not having a very elaborate or sound research design for your piece of writing? So perhaps there has to be a distinction between short-term research and long-term research, problem-driven interventions, or long-term scientific agendas. So there's a distinction between these kind of research writings, these kind of research endeavors. And this is also not without, that is to say, either policy recommendations or theoretical frameworks. This can be a smaller version of a long-term research in that sense, or a pilot research, as it were. So he subscribes to quasi-autonomous or interdependent research between policy and theory, and also says that sometimes good theory leads to good policy, and it's a two-way relationship where diagnosis of the research problem is important. What kind of framework one is applying is provided by theory, and what is the outcome that one wants out of this entire enterprise is policy. So this kind of quasi-autonomous relationship between theory and policy can give rise to a good research in that sense. Contrary to this, there are many other scholars who also believe that sometimes good theory can lead to bad policy and vice versa. So more on that can come in the course of discussion. I'll leave you with this thought to hold. I'll just try to, I mean, this is a small slide on what is a good theory. So by now I'm sure that everybody is quite confident of explaining what a theory is, and therefore what is a good theory or what is a bad theory can be a very generic question in that sense. But very logically, what a theory should stand for is consistency, logical consistency, its ability to be empirically valid, its capacity to be explanatory, where it's able to identify causal factors for a particular important phenomenon. its completeness, that is, there should not really be a very debilitating gap in that particular theory. And finally, it's interesting, and it's more it lends more longevity to a theory if it's also prescriptively rich. That is it yields useful recommendations, which is where again this whole idea of very narrow gap between policy and theory comes in. So I had also suggested two more readings, and I'm going to devote very small time to both of them. You can ask me questions later if you have any. One was by Paul Post, which was about diets are dead, long-lived diets, the limits of dyadic designs in international research. Most of us are familiar with what dyads are, and dyads data analysis basically refers to analysis of data in pairs. Now, every time you want to do a bilateral sort of analysis in international relations, that's also called a dyadical analysis. So if you have India, Pakistan, India, China, you have India, Bangladesh, this kind of a bilateral perspective in your head. Probably what you're going to do, or what you could be doing, is bringing in certain concurrent or bringing in certain parallel quantitative method, which is dyadic data analysis. And so if you do poverty estimation in India, you do corresponding poverty estimation in China, and so on and so forth. So you create dyads out of both your quantitative and your qualitative component of research. Now, dyad members are mostly taken as indistinguishable, and sometimes they're also taken as exchangeable, and there is no in purely statistical term, there's no distinguishing variable between a dyad. So therefore, when you do a dyadic kind of study between in social sciences, particularly say in IR, it's important to be wary of certain pitfalls here. So if you're pitting China with India, that you're actually putting them together, you're also doing away with the scope of distinguishing them. So a dyad is also giving rise to, in qualitative terms, giving rise to the idea of binaries. So you also pit it as either or. So in game theory, it becomes a zero-sum game. So either one will benefit and therefore other will lose, or vice versa, and that kind of a scenario. So dyad has to be very uh, uh, cautiously used in terms of qualitative analysis, and in quantitative, it has to be understood that the data should be concurrent to each other, right? And if you're doing an analysis of a multilateral event or a phenomena, if you're trying to say, for instance, look at multipolarity in IR, if you're trying to look at BRICS as one of the core components of your research, then perhaps dyads is not going to serve your purpose. And in that case, one should shy away from using it. In fact, not use it at all. The other reading that I had asked you to read, was by Mark Sheffer. It was on science, empiricism, and tolerance in the study of foreign policy making. So I'm going to just focus very briefly on tolerance, the idea of tolerance, because that's also one of the important standpoints. It's important vantage points or referent to start doing research in IR, particularly foreign policy making. Basically, this article focuses on various practices in research in the field of international relations in general and foreign policy analysis in particular, and tries to bring in the component of tolerance in all of these practices. The most important aspect of tolerance with regards to both the subfields and the methodological approaches is that the practice of tolerance should perhaps be inculcated while bringing in an amalgamated version of methodological approaches. So you might have different methodologies at your disposal. You might want to use them without being either biased against one or biased for one in that sense. And the second aspect of tolerance in this case is the importance of empirical research in general, and answering the questions posed by the debates in the sense of a qualitative reference point. So you have tolerance for methodology, you have tolerance for the argument from different subfields of the discipline, you have tolerance for the idea that the argument which is contrary to your finding can also have certain amounts of truth hidden in it, and therefore in the grander version of reality, it's important to take note of the other side. So this is an interesting exercise, and mostly in terms of diplomacy, foreign policy, and IR, we use this particular value as a referent value, the tolerance, the value of tolerance, in terms of looking at while trying to make a particular argument. Now, the final reading that I had given you was by Susan Hyde, and it was about experiments in international relations, lab, survey, and field. Very briefly, the main points of this reading that I want you to focus upon was that through all of these experimentations, the techniques of experimentations, lab, survey, and field, and so on and so forth, what we gain is the precision in methodological design of a particular research. It can also give a controlled, unparalleled casual insight and innovative theoretical clarification and direction if you employ all of these, any of these or all of these methods. Even though she does qualify this entire, use or usage of this particular set of methods by saying that experiment research methods have been hierarchized over other kind of methods within quantitative methods, and it has, even though there has been certain skepticism there, but the debate is basically not about whether experiments can be used to study any meaningful questions central to IR. The debate is more about the ethical premise of experiments. So when you do an experimentation based research through lab, survey, or field, the question is primarily in the realm of ethics. What kind of experiments are justified and what kind of experiments are not justified? So if one can bring in just the very topical thematic here, which is COVID and the kind of conspiracy theories that are running abound regarding this. I mean, what caused the virus? Where did the virus actually come from? So if one was looking at one of the conspiracy theories, which is basically that it is a result of a bad experiment in the lab somewhere in China. Now that would be a question which can sort of be looked at if one wants to elaborate upon. That can be looked at what kind of research is justified in terms of biological warfare, in terms of bioterrorism, and so on and so forth. The second kind of ethical question that has emerged out of this entire debate is there a rich disease? Is there a rich man's disease which basically kills poor people? So these kind of questions actually run into this realm, and if you do certain experiment-based research to bring out questions of this nature in public realm, the question is primarily of that of an ethical nature rather than whether it can be done or not. Yeah, I'll stop here and I'll now invite questions. Are there any questions? And we'll just follow what we did yesterday. If someone can just read out the questions that are, if someone is typing, if anybody is typing on the screen.
Ritusha, thank you.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me, Ritusha?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Ritusha. Thank you for the class today. And I hope I have unmuted everyone.
Yes, Richa.
Okay. So shall we start taking questions? You can, I mean, announce your name and start asking the questions if you have. I think Reena and Sanjana are not. Ritusha, I think I'll start with the first question.
All right.
Talk about when you were talking about qualitative methods and quantitative methods, you spoke about coding the material. I wasn't clear about what exactly you meant by coding the material. So that is one question. that I have,
Uh-huh.
and the other one is about standardized data and non-standardized. Like how do you define a standardized data and non-standardized data? Make a distinction between both.
Okay.
You can get start. I mean, you can respond to those questions. I mean, and then we can take the next few questions, or do you want to just take in more questions and?
It would be ideally good if others have some questions regarding the same part of the lecture. If they can just voice it now, we can raise it now.
So shall
Because
we
then
go
I
one by
can.
one? Guys, you can start asking questions right now, or shall I go one by one?
Hi, Rityusha, this is Bihu.
Hi. Hi.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted, I wasn't clear about the difference between causation and correlation. Like it's confusing. So if you can explain it once more.
Okay. All right. Anybody else?
Akshit, Arnav, Karthik.
Hello.
Yes. Hello.
Ritisha, I was reading political methodology, especially on empirical methods. So they have talked about this ordinal variable and interval variable regarding coding of the variables.
Uh-huh.
So, I was still confused about differentiating these two variables. Like, if you can elaborate on this thing.
Uh-huh.
When to use ordinal variables and when to use interval variables.
What were you reading? Can you name the reading right now?
Yeah, this is political analysis by Philip. Philip. So in that he was talking about you have to use ordinal variables when you want to code either it's yes or no, either 1 or 0. Interval variables, he was specifying if you wanted to code something, magnitude of the variable. If you want to measure the magnitude of the variable, so for some variables you can award for if you want to show the magnitude, it's 1 to 10 or the numbers. So I'm still confused, when to use these both variables.
Okay.
And second question I have is regarding, you spoke about this, the conspiracy theories. So I was working on this blog on the two different conflicting narratives emerging amid COVID-19. So when you don't have the confirmation and the authenticity of the source of information on which you are making research, so is it viable to actually because still we don't know the authenticity of where the virus has been originated, because there are no scientific evidence to support the cause. So how do we deal with these kind of things, conspiracy theories? Because as an researcher, you have to make confirmation of your source, where it is arising from. So how do you deal with these things? Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll try to answer first these questions. Rija, you had talked about qualitative and quantitative in the context of standardized and non-standardized, right?
Yeah, basically the distinction between standardized data and non-standardized data, and my other question was about coding the material.
Okay. All right. So I'll begin with coding the material first. Okay. I'll get back to that particular slide. Okay, so I had used coding in context of qualitative methods. I hope I was clear in that sense. And basically, coding the material means that when you have a certain set of data, you try to put it into categories. You try to assign categories. So say you have a random data from Economic Survey of India, right? That's your source. And now you have the data level of, say, what is the maternal mortality rate, what is the life expectancy rate, what is the what is the nutritional rate for expecting mothers. You have this data, right? Now you want to put it into categories. You want to put it into a particular category, and this category you will envisage according to your research puzzle. So if you put it under the category, say, sociological indicators of women's health. Suppose this is the category that you've now designed for this set of random data you got from economic survey. Okay. You cull out the data from economic survey, which fits into this particular category. And this is called coding of an empirical data set.
Okay.
Am I clear?
Yeah, yeah.
So you have actually assigned qualitative meaning to your quantitative data. So you might have a lot of data regarding labor from ILO and many other organizations, right? Now you want to put it into a particular category. Say you want to put it in the category of migration. Or you want to look into the nutritional value available to a particular migrant worker. Now you will make use of different sets of data. You will put them as variables within a particular code of data. And this code is how you assign value or category or meaning, social, political, economic meaning to your data.
Okay.
Is that clear?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, the second question was about standardized and non-standardized data. Now, basically, if in statistical terms, what I have used is when you try to have different kind of this, I mean, you have disparate data sets and you want to bring them into a common data set, a common data format. So you want to, I'll give a very simple example. You have the data set from ILO, you have the data set from WTO, you have the data set from World Bank. Now they've not used the same scales. They might have different quantities by which they are measuring their data, but you want to now put it all together in one table. So what you do is basically, you first of all, you make the measuring scales similar by finding out the ratio between different data, right? So someone might have it by kg by say meter square, and somebody might have it by grams per kilometer. I mean, I'm giving random examples, but you standardize it now by putting it all together in one table. So this is standardization of data. Even though the value might be similar, I mean, value might be in the similar category. It might all be about poverty, but it might not be in a standardized format.
Right,
so this is called data standardization. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So next question was about causation and correlation. Now, so first, basically what you do between your two variables, democracy and governance. Suppose these are the two variables. What you do is, you basically try to first find out the correlation. Is there a correlation between democracy and governance? For instance, correlation could simply mean, as democracy is increasing, governance is also improving. Very generic, right? But there is a correlation that something is happening because something is there. So this is simply correlation. You try to plot it on a graph. You put your dependent variable on x-axis, which is your horizontal axis. You put your independent variable on your vertical y-axis. And then you try to plot what was the level of democracy and what was the level of governance in that case, right? And then you see whether there is a particular kind of, can I just take a moment's break? There's someone at the door. Just a moment.
Sure.
Sorry, yeah, am I visible and audible?
Yeah, Ritusha.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I had to see somebody at the door. Yeah. So you first of all put correlation between two variables. That are they at all related with each other? Is there any kind of relation? Causation, on the other hand, is what causes what. right? Whether it's the democracy, increasing levels or improving levels of democracy, in turn leading to improving measures of governance, or is it the other way around? That is causation. So causation would tell us what the correlation is actually in which the correlation is in which direction. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Rityusha, yeah. So, few years back, there was this data that came out that it was regarding populism. So, in with regard to the French election, so as the data was that as the far right candidates' popularity is increasing, the unemployment rate is also increasing. So,
Okay.
what? How do this is correlation? This is not causation, or I mean,
No, as the unemployment was raising, sorry,
the
what was the
as the popularity of the far right candidate was rising, as she was faring better in each elections, the rise of unemployment was also there. Unemployment was also rising with the
no? So in this statement, there is already a causation, that rise of far right leading to more unemployment. Okay.
okay.
Before that comes the step. Before that comes the step whether unemployment and far right are related in any sense.
Okay.
So correlation is a step before causation.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Now, next question was with regards to ordinal variable, and I think you also mentioned variation variable. Yeah. Now,
Interval variable.
Okay, interval variable. Now, the very, I mean, these are again statistical tools that are employed many a times, and this is basically a category to assignment to variables. Now, it depends. Mostly, ordinal variables are when you want to basically bring out certain distinction between two sets of data. So, can you distinguish it between, say, there is the thing that you have to investigate is education, and you want to basically talk about certain statistics in terms of education. Now, if you say that higher education is very much distinguishable from primary education, then you can make higher education one ordinal variable and primary education as another ordinary variable, because ordinal variable, because it's possible to bring out the distinction between the two of them. Am I clear in that sense? Is it answering your question?
Yeah.
So if you have distinguishable category of data where it's easy to bring out the distance or the distinction between the two sets of variables, you assign them as you take them as ordinal variables. Now, in case of interval variables, you said interval, right? Not variation. So interval variables is again basically where the differences between the two of them is quite meaningful. It's possible to find out in interval. Actually, a ratio variable is also used. So when you have I would want to give it in terms of example. Say you have certain age set with you, right? And common thing for the entire age set is elderly. So if you want to do a study on the care of elderly, right? Now, within the elderly, everybody will be elderly, suppose after 60, if we have chosen that as our basic age for elderly. Now, after 60, you might have a lot of distinction, right? You might have somebody in 70s, somebody in 80s, somebody in 90s, and so on and so forth. Now, all of this is very related, but still there is certain kind of distinction here. There is a difference, even though that difference can be done away with in terms of this context of elderly, because the policies will be the same for everybody. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah.
So within that category or codification of data, for all the elderlies, the policy recommendation will be same. At the same time, you want to bring out certain meaningful difference in their ages. So then probably you go on by calling them octogenarian, septuagenarian, and so on and so forth, right? And you bring on those very subtle differences by putting in interval variables. So interval variables are not primary to your research. They are a part of your codification in this case. Is that okay?
Yeah. So like regarding, this causation and correlation effect, for instance, if we have another variable, I mean, independent variable, which is, influencing the causation and the correlation.
There'll always be an independent variable and there'll always be a dependent variable between which you're trying to situate the correlation. And that once the correlation has been situated, then you can actually answer the causation. How did the independent variable influence the dependent variable? This question can be answered by explaining the causation.
But not like necessarily that independent variable always influences an dependent variable. There are some other variables which also comes into play.
No. Let's not confuse this. There is independent variable, there is dependent variable, and then what you're trying to bring in is intervening variable.
Yeah.
Is that okay? So your primary idea is to tell the causation. So you tell that independent variable impacts dependent variable in so and so manner. At the same time, there is an intervening variable which is either decreasing the impact of intervening independent variable or increasing the impact of intervening independent variable. So there is an intervention by intervening variable. Okay, and it is outside this dependent independent correlation. But there is an impact by the intervening which either increases or decreases the impact of independent variable. Am I clear?
Yeah.
Ritisha, maybe you can give an example, maybe. Mahesh, will that be helpful?
Yeah, of course. That
why don't you bring your, I mean, I can, but then that becomes an imposition of my example. So I might be comfortable.
Instance,
so you bring in a
like electoral, for instance, in electoral democracy, why do people of higher education go for less voting, and why do poor go for why do poor go in large numbers? So here, what could be the intervening variable? So we have a
so wait. Let's first of all put it in terms of a research puzzle or a hypothesis. The two variables at hand in this case are levels of education
and
right?
the income status of the particular category.
Levels of education and income status and propensity to vote on the other hand, right? So level of income and education becomes one code within which you have income and education, right? Two data, income and education. So this is the coding of your data. So this becomes your socio-economic status, right? This is one variable. And then the other variable is propensity to vote.
Yeah.
All right. Propensity to vote becomes dependent. These two become independent.
Okay.
Together. All right. Now you want to bring in an intervening variable. You go to the field, right? You start doing surveys. You see whether regional variation is one of the intervening variables. You have your two causal correlation inducing two variables already, and you go to the field. You try to see whether these two are being plotted on X and Y and then coming into a closed set of correlated regressional analysis, or is there something which is intervening time and again? This something could be regional variation. What may be true for Kerala may not be true for Punjab. What may be true for Tripura may not be true for Maharashtra, so on and so forth. The other intervening variable could be gender, irrespective of, say, income and educational levels. Maybe women are voting more, or maybe they are voting less. So other intervening variable could be gender in this case. There could be X and Y numbers of intervening variables here. It depends what you find out in the field from the sample of data you have collected. Is that understood?
Yeah.
Okay. I will now try to give an example from my side. See, you have okay, let's try to bring a war analogy here. Chances of conflict are higher amongst nations who trade less. Let's have this as a hypothesis. Now, which is basically to say that interdependent economies don't fight, right? In other words. So war becomes one variable. The other variable becomes trade. Now you have to see that how and which is impacting which. From this statement, it is sure that economics is impacting war, right? So economics becomes your independent variable. Your dependent variable becomes war. Now let's see if there is any other intervening variable here. Right? Intervening could be security dilemmas. Intervening could be military complexes. Intervening could be your military strategic partnerships. If there are countries which are into partnerships in terms of military and strategy and security, suppose they are a part of Theater Missile Defense Treaty, TMD. And even though they are trading amongst themselves less, they are not likely to fight more. Or otherwise, when you have a country from TMD set of countries, you are trying to say that it is going to fight even if it is, so if it is one of the countries in your data set and the other countries is a non-TMD country, even though when they have huge trade, you might see a lot of conflict simmering in the background. Japan, China. Yeah, hot economics, very cold politics. This is how they categorize it. Right? So intervening variable could be actually according to the context in which you're trying to operate your two variables, the independent and the dependent variable. You have to put a context, and in that context, if that intervening variable is present, it's easily one of the possibilities which is affecting your result or your causation or your degree of correlation. Is that understood?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
like
now
you pointed
finally,
out one of the exception that between the Japan and China, despite of
I did
having
not point out the exception. I said that despite having great trade, they might not end up, they might have some sort of conflict.
So that could be is it not a limitation like what we are trying to prove here as an hypothesis between
No, it's not a limitation. It's basically putting in more clarity to your the causality that you're establishing between your two variables.
So
it's not a limitation.
So for instance, I have one example in my mind, like during World War II, like Germany and Britain had huge amount of trade relations, but despite of having in large scale trade relations, so both the countries went to war. So so how will we so this is obviously, this example is contradicting what
no, that is why I'm saying if when you give a hypothesis, it's possible to give a null hypothesis. It's possible to give a falsifiable hypothesis. Null hypothesis would mean that I posited something and actually in the field it's wrong. So then I come back and I revise my thing and I say that this is not what it is. In fact, this is what it is.
Okay.
So you begin with a certain set of assumption which you try to prove true. It does not prove true. That means you have a null hypothesis at hand, and you can present that as your research instead of saying that opposite is true. Because you've not tested opposite. You've tested this. This has proven to be untrue. So you say that this is untrue and that's it. That's your result. Whether the opposite is also true, that we have to again go back to the field and see. Because there might be corollaries, there might be intervening variables in that case also. And that is not what we've done research on.
Ritusha, I think Hariharan has a doubt in terms of, intervening variables that you were explaining.
Sure.
So he's asking that, can you explain it in terms of democratic peace theory? The intervening variables.
So, democracies don't fight with each other. You might want to have a intervening variable here. Now the democracies are having a gala time in Western Hemisphere, for instance, but suddenly Trump decides that he doesn't want the COVID-19 related PPE reaching Canada. Both of them are best buddies and they are like democracies to boot. And they might get into a conflict because now when it comes to the idea of basic securitization of human population there, they are fighting on one of the basic things, which is basically the PPE. So in this case, the intervening variable is a pandemic, right? It depends. The context will decide whether we can bring in a particular intervening variable or not while trying to establish causality.
Hariharan, I hope it answers your question. I just wanted to go back to Mahesh's one more question. I think Mahesh had one more question, right? Regarding conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I have that question. Yeah. So should I answer that now?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, when you have a lot of conspiracy theories don't make a research at all, first of all. And they are called conspiracy theories because of that reason, because they don't have a testifiable, verifiable, and falsifiable proposition to make. They are conjectures in the air. And most of them are, most of the times, very motivated conjectures in the air and do not have a falsifiable, verifiable, quantifiable argument in that sense. Therefore, when one is trying to do a research, even in terms of writing a blog, because you want your written word to have some sort of meaning, not propaganda. So one should shy away from conspiracy theory in that sense. What can be surmised should only be based on the facts available at that point in time. So when you're writing a blog, how much can you trust a source? Now, if you cannot trust the source, it's most important that you tell in your research that this is the source of the data, although it is not totally verified. And there have been questions raised regarding the authenticity of the source in the first place. So to bring in this kind of qualifying statements is important in any tentative research. A blog is a tentative research. You're giving your opinion, right? But your opinion is also not without facts. So it's important to bring in a qualifying statement and say that even though the sources consulted included this one particular source whose authenticity has been questioned, probably given the large amount of testable, authentic sources that I have consulted, probably we can see the result in this direction. So then it's also important that you don't just include the sources whose authenticity is questioned. In fact, you include them less in number. More of your sources should be more authentic, testifiable, verifiable sources. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ritisha, we have Akshit asking another question. He's asking whether inclusion of quantitative methods in research, which are primarily heavy on qualitative analysis, help improve the credibility of research.
As I said, that now the distinction between qualitative and quantitative is not that great. In fact, it's more of an accepted practice to bring in a mixed method. Most of the research today employ both qualitative and quantitative because they are complementary to each other. We did cover those 5-6 points as to how they complement each other at every level of research design. So that idea of bifurcation of quantity and quality in that sense is more and more negated in contemporary research in that sense. That is not to say that there are not any theoretical researches happening, which probably have not been tested at all in the field. They are happening, and they many a times serve as some of the primary research sources for more quantitative research in future. It's not just that quantitative research brings in quality into the qualitative this thing. It's both ways. It's always a two-way process.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Sanjana, Tanishka, Priyanka? Anyone? Is everyone unmuted? Please unmute. I mean, I have unmuted everyone.
Hello?
You have to unmute yourself from accept the unmute.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Rija. Hello.
Yeah. Who's this?
Yeah, I think most of the questions have been asked, so I have no questions.
Okay, then we should see each other now on Thursday, same time.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll
And
just
Ritisha,
send the last batch of readings. I'll just request everybody who's attended today and yesterday that in case you have related questions from the readings that I had circulated, both yesterday, today, and the ones I'm going to circulate for day after tomorrow's class, please don't feel shy in asking any questions from there. In fact, I would encourage that you read your readings and come to this session, because then it will be more helpful.
yeah, and also, I mean, whatever you're working on, your analysis or
Yeah.
your blog, you can ask questions related to that. If you're having difficulties kind of finding your research questions and everything and fine tuning it, you can always ask Ritusha about it.
Yeah, so every time I say that bring an example from your context, probably the best and the smart idea is to ask your research question here,
Yeah.
so that we can refine it better, we can put it in a better shape and so on and so forth.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hi, this is Hari. I have one quick question.
Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned that conspiracy theories must be ignored. With that, given the current situation, say for example COVID-19, that is something happening right now. So not much literature will be available when in terms of analyzing our research question. Of course, there are literature. What I meant is like, say you take a specific question and work on it, but not many literature is there. Review articles or something. But these articles are opinion. It's biased. It might be it might be leaning towards particular opinion. In that case, how do you proceed? Because right now it's current situation, right?
Yeah, so first of all, in a currently unfolding situation, it's very difficult to reach any kind of conclusive argument. So one can actually map the trajectory of that unfolding phenomena. That's one way of doing it, and then try to sort of just give future possibilities instead of saying that this is what it's going to be. Probably 7-8 scenarios are possible, and it's important, interesting to visualize all 7-8 scenarios and say that these are the 7-8 scenarios, ethically speaking, morally speaking, or from the point of view of geopolitics of your location. You can always say that out of these 7, this is desirable for us, this is desirable for India, this is desirable for this set of people, this is desirable for migrant workers, this is desirable for women who are caught in domestic abuse kind of situation. So it depends what's your perspective of writing that article, and you can always say that all of these all of this currently unfolding situation can actually turn into these 7-8 possibilities, and this 7-8 possibilities, out of this, probably most desirable one is defined by how you have put your question to begin with. Nothing, no piece of writing can be without at least one kind of question, one question that you're trying to answer. So you have to be very clear about what's the question that you're trying to answer in that 1,000-word piece also.
So, thanks.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, that helped.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna just circulate the readings in say half an hour, and please do read and come. All right, see you then day after.
Okay. Thank you, Ritusha.
Okay, thank you
See you
everybody.
day after tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.